From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about the Buy American program. United States President Joe Biden announced a plan Wednesday to strengthen Buy American policies. He is proposing to increase U.S.-made content in hundreds of billions of dollars of government purchases.
If American companies know that we're going to be buying from them, they're going to be more inclined to hire and make key investments in the future in their companies, like you're doing here.
The White House said it was proposing legislation to update the 1933 Buy American Act. This will pressure businesses that supply the government to add more U.S.-made materials into their supply chains. It will apply $600 billion in annual government spending. The White House said the move would boost small and medium-sized manufacturers around the country. While speaking at the Mack Trucks manufacturing facility in Pennsylvania yesterday, the president also said he wants this expansion of manufacturing to bring back union jobs.
But I reject out of hand this defeatist view that the forces of automation and globalization mean we can't have good-paying union jobs in America.
Union job shares in America have decreased by roughly half to 10.3% since 1983. America's economy is showing progress, but it is not yet fully recovered, according to the federal government. Vaccinations and the economic stimulus are fueling the ongoing recovery to hit a near-record pace in the second quarter. Federal officials signaled they are moving closer to reducing massive support for the U.S. economy. But they said they are not there yet. Here is U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at a press conference in Washington, D.C.
Right, that's what the guidance is for liftoff. We had to have labor market conditions consistent with full employment, inflation at 2% and on track to run moderately above 2% for some time. It really isn't relevant now. Because we're looking at tapering asset purchases. We're clearly a ways away from considering raising interest rates. It's not something that is on our radar screen right now.
A comprehensive analysis on these news items related to the U.S. economy is coming up later in our show, so please keep watching Muslim News. A ProPublica investigation has found that automated computer programs filed faked claims for unemployment checks during the pandemic. In one instance, the same Social Security number was used to file claims in 40 states and received over $200,000 from 29 state agencies. The investigation reveals that the problem extends far beyond solo scammers. It also indicates that much of the fraud is well organized in the U.S. and abroad. Claims have originated from China using teams of low-wage workers. The well-organized fraud has its own online infrastructure that has gone unnoticed by the mainstream media. It targets aging or obsolete state unemployment systems whose weaknesses have been publicized for decades, yet no action has been taken to fix them. The number of claims in 5 states exceeded the entire pool of civilian workers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These were from Arizona, Georgia, Hawaii, Nevada, and Rhode Island. A 30-year-old man has been arrested in relation to a series of anti-Muslim hate crimes in Queens, New York. Naved Dorni of Jamaica, New York, has been charged with menacing as a hate crime and assault as a hate crime. He has also been charged with criminal possession of a weapon and aggravated harassment. If convicted, he faces up to 8 years in prison. Dorni's latest attack happened on Sunday. That was when police say he pushed a woman in hijab to the ground and threatened her with a knife after making anti-Muslim statements. The previous 2 attacks took place on June 20th. In those, he made anti-Muslim statements to 2 separate Muslim couples. In one of the incidents, he punched a woman in hijab in the head and face several times, leaving her with a fractured nose and cuts. Prosecutor Marissa Pulido requested that Dorni be held on $30,000 bail, and his defense attorney asked that he be given a psychiatric evaluation. Judge Edwin Novillo ordered him detained pending the evaluation. Derny turned himself into police on Tuesday after seeing his photo on the news. President of Muslim Advocates, Farhana Khera, has resigned after 16 years of service. Muslim Advocates is a leading national civil rights and legal advocacy organization. Under Khera's leadership, it achieved historic and significant progress for the American Muslim community. Khera resigned after the board of directors requested a review of her management following complaints from former staff. Khera has accused the board of discrimination. Muslim Advocates has opened an investigation into the matter. They have hired law firm Dabavois and Plimpton to investigate Khera's allegation of discrimination. The firm will also look into former staff allegations of workplace hostility. Farah Borelvi and Asifa Qureshi Landas will be interim co-executive directors of Muslim Advocates. Both women were founding board members of the organization. On the international front, we have good news from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Samia Suluhu Hassan, the country's new president, has launched a national COVID vaccination drive. Tanzania is one of the last countries in the world to start inoculating its people. The move is a departure from the practice of the last president, John Magufuli. He had mocked the efficacy of masks, testing, and other health measures to curb COVID-19. After his death in March, Suluhu Hassan was sworn in as his successor. She had been elected vice president in 2015 with Magufuli, who had chosen her as his running mate when he ran for president. Hassan is the first Muslim woman head of state in Africa and Tanzania's first female president. Since coming into power, she has been promoting science-based measures to curb the spread of the virus in the country of 58 million people. The mass vaccine rollout started with Hassan herself getting her jab after a ceremony broadcast live on television in Dar es Salaam. The African Union has instituted a COVID-19 passport. This is to control the present pandemic and to serve as a blueprint to rein in future outbreaks. Dubbed Trusted Travel, the passport program started in late 2020. It was created by the African Union Secretariat and the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. It supports its 55 member states in verifying COVID-19 test certificates. The program standardizes screening and provides travel requirement information at exit and entry ports. It also lists government-approved labs for COVID testing and allows travelers to upload their test results online for verification by health and travel officials. Nkesi Ndembi, Chief Science Officer at the Africa CDC, said the program closes the gaps. This is by linking various databases and offering a secure system that cannot be abused by false records. Ndembi said this will help African policymakers predict dangerous trends in disease transmission before outbreaks occur. Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said Wednesday that trusting the West does not work. He was referring to the experience of a 2015 nuclear deal with major Western powers. The move gave Iran some relief from international sanctions. It was in exchange for limits on its nuclear program. But in 2018, former U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and reimposed punishing sanctions on Iran. This battery will provide 100 hours of energy storage for 10% of the current cost. Form Energy has signed agreements to build a 300-megawatt pilot facility in Minnesota. While lithium batteries are the dominant player today, a company called Form Energy is about to challenge its domination. It has revived the concept of a metal-air battery. The metal and air combination is attractive because it uses abundant and low-cost materials like iron and oxygen, as opposed to the rare and expensive lithium. Last summer, Form Energy built a prototype of a 1-meter-tall iron-air battery. Thousands of these batteries can be connected to fill large warehouses to store weeks' worth of electricity. If that is successful, it could open the door for the deployment of large batteries that will be a key factor in a carbon-free future. Amid the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, thousands have been displaced and killed. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
There are lines in Afghanistan, lines in the passport office, and lines on the border with Pakistan. The Afghans are fleeing. Some had worked for Americans and are fearful of the Taliban. Others are worried about the future. But they are all fleeing the war. The passport office is dealing with 10,000 people a day. That's 5 times the daily 2,000 rate. The Taliban and America negotiated and signed the peace agreement. The Taliban claims that Americans broke the deal by not leaving at the end of May. So they are fighting, and Afghans are running for peace, running for life. Refugees from Afghanistan were the second largest group by country of origin. UN records show that 270,000 Afghans have been displaced just this year. It brings the total number to almost 4 million in 2021, as compared to 2.7 million in 2018. This is in addition to 3.5 million internally displaced refugees. Pakistan and Iran host about 90% of the Afghan refugees. While in line or displaced, Afghans are dying as well. The UN says that Afghanistan could see this year the highest number of civilian deaths in more than a decade. More than 71,000 of those killed have been civilians. The war in Afghanistan started 40 years ago with the Soviet invasion. The Soviets left in the Civil War. Then the United States invaded it. The US is leaving it now. But there is still no peace.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Earlier tonight, we shared the news of President Biden's Buy American program and the latest statement of U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell about the U.S. economy. Economist Dr. Fadl Kaboub is joining Saleha Farouk for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Saleha.
Once again, thank you very much. Today, we're very happy as well to be joined by Dr. Fadl Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University, as well as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Dr. Fadl, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. Now, for our viewers to be able to understand, what does it mean when President Biden wants to increase the share of U.S.-made parts for government purchases? And what is the Buy American all about?
So the Buy American Act is something that was introduced back in the 1930s and has stayed in place since then. And it essentially mandates that a certain percentage of the content of products that the federal government, states and municipalities in the U.S. is to be made or assembled in the United States. In some specific cases, it mandates especially that the steel content, and this is why the steel industry is really one of the biggest benefactors of the Buy American Act historically, is to be made or assembled in the United States. But the recent push for kind of updating and upgrading and reinforcing this Buy American approach has really been triggered by the pandemic, by the supply chain disruptions that we've experienced in the United States and other parts of the world. But what is often also missing from the conversation is the concern in the United States about the rise of China in particular as an economic superpower, as a geopolitical rival to the United States. And as a result, when the pandemic hit, a lot of people recognize that a lot of that supply chain has been outsourced to China and other parts of the world, and that it was not benefiting the U.S. economy, the U.S. workers, and from a national security standpoint as a result of that. And the final thing I want to add here is the fact that the political tensions that we've seen in the United States over the last 5 or 6 years, since really the 2016 election cycle, especially in this part of the country, in the Midwest and the deindustrialized parts of the Midwest and small towns that were essentially neglected by both Democrats and Republicans for decades, those communities felt like a nerve has been pinched when Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders came to Appalachia, to the deindustrialized towns of the Midwest, and said, "We recognize your pain. We know you've been neglected and thrown under the bus by previous administrations. We're not politicians in the traditional sense. We're going to do things differently." And that triggered a huge momentum of political support on the right for the narrative of Donald Trump and on the left for the narrative of Bernie Sanders. And that nerve is still raw to this day. So the Biden administration is recognizing that outsourcing jobs for decades and neglecting communities has been a huge economic mistake and a huge political mistake. And so some of the motivation behind reintroducing a lot of the manufacturing jobs back in the United States is also motivated by that social and political tension.
Thank you for that insight. You mentioned a little bit about the pandemic. You highlighted that really well. Let's get into that a little bit. This ambitious proposal coincides with increased federal spending on contracts because of the pandemic. In your opinion, how will doing this address or solve supply chain issues?
Well, the biggest component of the supply chain disruptions that we're currently experiencing in the U.S. has to do with microchips. And electronics components, which have been, obviously vital for manufacturing cars and trucks and computer systems that are used in hospitals, are used in pretty much everything in manufacturing or consumer products. So not only is it part of the supply chain for consumer products, but it's also part of the supply chain for national security items, for public health security and so on. And it's also a high-tech sector that creates relatively good-paying jobs, under the right circumstances, obviously. So there's that dual motivation of bringing those jobs in the United States. And many countries, to be honest, have recognized that they too need to build a more resilient supply chain domestically, as opposed to the global supply chain that we've seen developed over the last 30 or 40 years, to be honest, since the rise of the kind of free trade kind of WTO era. So some of that is happening in the U.S., and it's just the momentum is ripe for it because there's the need for rebuilding quite a bit of the infrastructure in the U.S., creating a more equitable economy for communities that have been neglected for a long time. Large infrastructure spending that's about to be unleashed in the United States to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with so many problems that have been shoved under the rug for a long time. So this supply chain component is just one element of this. And the last thing I want to add that many people may not have noticed in the last few months is that Congress is still divided between Republicans and Democrats in terms of what to spend on and what are the things that we agree on that we can actually vote and move forward, vote on and move forward with. And unfortunately, it's been one of the unifying themes of in the political sphere has been opposition to the rise of China. So you would think that the United States would prioritize investing in science and technology and research and development. It's a no-brainer. It's a good thing. But apparently, it's not good enough to say that we want to invest in science and technology and innovation and all of that unless you justify it by saying this will be a way to counter the rise of China in the global economy, the rise of China as a geopolitical challenger to the United States. You add the anti-China label to it, and all of a sudden, everybody in Congress likes it and votes for it. So that is kind of the underlying political tone in the United States government today. And so everything that has a slight anti-China bias to it somehow makes it through Congress. And that is a dangerous rhetoric, obviously, not only to hijack the infrastructure spending, the science and technology spending and all that via this political process, but also to build this consistent bipartisan anti-China rhetoric, anti-Asian rhetoric, anti-the rest of the world rhetoric that seeps into the popular culture throughout the system. So that's a very important thing to acknowledge, to recognize, and to actually address.
That being said, I wanted to get your professional opinion on something that the Senate has recently agreed on quite historically. So, for example, many might see these changes as the beginning of improvements being made to the federal procurement process. But as part of the overall infrastructure deal, which passed through the Senate just yesterday, what do you foresee for the domestic policy agenda in the future for us?
Well, one of the things that we have to remember with the Buy American Act type of approach is that it does favor large businesses. I mentioned earlier the steel industry having been one of the biggest benefactors of the Buy American Act. Now, if you think of car manufacturers, for example, or users, consumers of steel as an input into their production, they would rather buy it from South Korea. They would rather buy it from Brazil. They would rather buy it from a European producer at a lower cost. Why? Because those producers have invested in more efficient production techniques, whereas the American steel producers for the last several decades have benefited from government subsidies and protectionist policies that kept them in business, even though the technology they used has been obsolete for decades. So the danger of using the Buy American approach at any cost is the danger of continuing to subsidize powerful, influential lobbying groups, price setters in the United States at the expense of consumers and other businesses, and at the expense of the environment. The steel industry has been exempt from the Clean Air Act for decades. Because their technology is not clean and their technology is obsolete. So these are things that concern me a lot when it comes to implementing these kind of pro-American big business types of initiatives without paying attention to the long-term consequences in terms of fairness, in terms of environmental costs, and kind of accumulating more and more power and influence within a small elite group of business groups in the United States. So that's something that concerns me.
And many also share that concern. For example, a lot of people are criticizing this policy decision, particularly the Chamber of Commerce, and they say that, for example, procurement officials do require more flexibility to get the right products and services, and that this policy perhaps doesn't give them that freedom. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not going to rush to endorse the Chamber of Commerce position because they too have their own problems there. because they're also part of the problem in terms of the global supply chain, decentralization, globalization that we've seen over the last few decades. So the example that I mentioned, if you're a car manufacturer, you want to buy the cheaper product from some other country as opposed to the subsidized, mandated product from the United States, from US manufacturer. But that doesn't mean we should allow a global race to the bottom at any cost. So this opens the door, for me at least, for a broader conversation about how we organize the global economy. I'll give you just one number just to illustrate how extractive, how abusive the international trade system, the international financial system has been for many countries, especially in the global south. If we divide the world into two units, rich countries versus poor countries, and we net out all financial transactions, including foreign direct investment, exports, interest payments, charity payments, donations, you name it, the net amount, the last numbers we have is $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. Now, that's part of the extractive global economic system. Part of it is the outsourcing, part of it is brain drain, part of it is all the economic development strategies that have been implemented and enforced by the World Bank, the IMF, and US foreign policy and economic policy in the global south. So the supply chain outsourcing is a small component of that. So when we have challenges like climate change, like poverty, like socioeconomic exclusion all over the global south, and we're trying to address those without redesigning the global financial system, this extractive engine that I described here, the $2 trillion that need to be flowing in the opposite direction from rich to poor countries, then all we're doing is just tweaking the system around the edges and not really addressing anything. So that global supply system that we have right now is not going to be, massively disrupted by this Buy American Act. It's got to be a much broader conversation about how do we rebalance the global economy without throwing people under the bus, whether it's in the United States or in other countries in the global south.
And as we conclude, let's get into that a little bit about throwing people under the bus, just in terms of implications for everyday workers. How does a policy like this perhaps encourage American manufacturers and companies to hire and invest in their own futures and in their own people?
Well, that's precisely why you see this reaction from the chambers of commerce in the US, because they see this as their industry being squeezed and forced to hire American workers at higher cost, as opposed to buying the cheaper inputs from other parts of the world. And this is a multifaceted problem, because when you look at the cost of doing business, especially for small businesses, it's not just wages, it's the cost of health insurance that they need to pay for that's unaffordable. And that opens the conversation about the reason why we have a movement in the US for universal healthcare, so that we shift the burden of healthcare cost away from businesses and away from employees themselves. Number two, the cost of retirement in the United States, which, at least when you look at the public option, which is Social Security, that's another significant tax burden on small businesses, in particular, the FICA tax, which goes for Social Security and medical care for the elderly in the United States. If we have a much more efficient healthcare system, universal healthcare system, and retirement benefit system, and take that burden off of the table, off of the backs of small businesses, then they will be able to pay decent wages to their employees here in the US, and they'll be able to bring some of those jobs back in the US. But unless we address that at the national level, you're always going to see either opposition from small businesses in particular to bringing those jobs here and producing things at a much higher cost and forcing some of them out of business because they're not going to be able to compete, or they'll be able to produce it at a higher cost and then pass on that cost to American consumers and driving the engine of inflation and the engine of unaffordable cost of living in the United States. So you can't just tweak one item without addressing all the other pieces of the system that are connected to it. And so far, we haven't completely had that full conversation about how do we redesign the entire engine of the US economy as opposed to tweaking just bits and pieces of it.
a critical discussion here today with Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University, as well as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Dr. Fadel, thank you so much for your valuable insight today.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Once again, our pleasure, and back to the new studio.
Thank you, Saliha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. The House Select Committee is investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. In a previous in-depth analysis segment, we discussed President Biden's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Let's watch it again.
National Security Council has issued a national strategy to fight domestic terrorism. It was a promise President Biden made on the first day in office, and 5 months now, the strategy is there. So what it is going to be like? Is it going to be another war on terror? Are we going to round up people, stop them on the traffic stops? How is it going to be? A lot of civil rights violations took place in the war on terror. Unending war, some still say. Is it a new chapter or is it a different war? To discuss with us is someone who is an expert in domestic as well as overseas terrorism, Dr. Colin Clark. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Clark is Director of Policy and Research at Sufan Group. Tell us, what is this strategy now to fight domestic terrorism? So we know it now how to do it?
Yeah, so it's a multi-pronged strategy laid out by the administration, overseen by the National Security Council, that looks to get a handle on an issue that's been, growing in importance in this country, and that I think was crystallized by the Capitol insurrection of January 6th. It's essentially looking at both groups and organizations as well as individuals and movements. So everything from the Oath Keepers to the Proud Boys to the 3 Percenters. As well as individuals motivated by the QAnon conspiracy theory and other violent extremists. And it's, again, there's 4 pillars of the approach. Some of it will look at disinformation and attempt to introduce the concept of digital literacy. Other aspects of the approach will offer more tools and resources to federal law enforcement.
So why it took 5 months to develop that? Because what you just said, probably you already knew about it.
Well, you've got to get interagency buy-in across the U.S. government. This isn't something that is going to be handed on from top down. There's got to be a kind of organic agreement among various aspects, because for this to really work, we need total buy-in across the U.S. government. This is something that we're also talking about, rooting out extremism from the ranks of the U.S. military. So this is the DoD, this is the intelligence community, Department of Homeland Security, really a government-wide enterprise. And we often hear this phrase, whole of government approach. It's thrown around. It's probably overused. It's a bit hackneyed and well-worn. But I think for something like domestic terrorism, we really need to mean it, and it's got to work for the strategy to be effective.
Fighting war on terror overseas is easy, just bomb the world around you. How are you going to do that here? Because issue is ideologically connected. It says, strategy says it needs to be ideologically neutral. How you could be ideologically neutral when most of the military bases, people are watching only Fox News? That's ideology, whether you like it or not like it.
Look, there's a lot of challenges left still. I think, chief in my mind is dealing with the militias, right? Because what they're doing is technically not illegal. In this country, you can criticize the government. You can do so forcefully. You can also own an unlimited amount of weapons and ammunition. It's what makes these groups threatening. It's when they cross the line and start, agitating toward violence that things become illegal. But that's also when the issue, right? It's too late once we start seeing violence. But I don't think we should look at this as a global war on terrorism on the domestic front. There's a lot of different laws and policies and authorities that apply overseas that don't apply here, and vice versa. So I would look at this really as what it is. It's a strategy to counter domestic terrorism. And there's no question that, particularly among far-right extremists, we've got an issue that's grown in importance over the last 5-7 years, I'd say.
I mean, they emphasize, as I mentioned in my question, ideological neutrality. I mean, if 20% of America, according to surveys, believe in QAnon ideology, I mean, it's a conspiracy theory, but it has risen to the level of ideology. And people are listening to a different media. They got all different systems of communication. So U.S. government has spent about $500 million to counter ISIS propaganda by creating its own propaganda. I don't know what it was, which video were ISIS and which video were actually CIA video. Are we going to engage in all of that in countering this ideology? But if we do that, how we are ideologically neutral?
Well, it's illegal to use propaganda against the U.S. population. So first of all, the answer is no. I don't think it's about being ideologically neutral as much as it is about being agnostic to the ideology. So what the strategy says is we don't really care if it's left-wing, right-wing, jihadist-inspired, violence. We want to understand the ideology, but we're not playing favorites here, right? We're not only going after far-right extremists or only going after far-left extremists. That's what they mean by, we should be ideologically agnostic. We shouldn't really care necessarily about which ideology is motivating the violence, because we treat it for what it is, which is terrorism and political violence. And the law needs to be applied equally.
In war on terror, and as well as war on drugs, I mean, both wars still continue in one way or the other. There were instruments which were used, which were very clear violation of civil rights, like secret evidence. Do you think those instruments are still available for fight on domestic terrorism?
I hope not. And I think that even the framing of this, right? The war on terrorism was a terrible frame. One, it's not accurate. Terrorism is a tactic. You can't declare war in a tactic, just like we didn't declare war against Blitzkrieg in World War II. We declared war against the Axis powers. We often use this metaphor, as you mentioned, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on crime, because it's a way to simplify an issue and everybody wants to get behind it. But I think it's often myopic and short-sighted. And I think, it often leads to unintended consequences. The war on drugs is a great example. And we're now seeing many of those laws undone. If you look at marijuana legalization across the country, which has had, a lot of issues related to racial inequity, right? Much higher rates of African Americans incarcerated for the same crime that, many white Americans were committing as well. So I think I don't really like the whole framing of the war on terror. I think, this is a strategy to counter domestic terrorism, but we shouldn't look at this as a war, particularly as it pertains to, the U.S. population.
Civil rights, popped up in this strategy document by the National Security Council. We are in the beginning stages of considering this domestic terrorism to be a real threat. In war on terror, that thing didn't quite come as often. So there were instruments in place which are legal. As I mentioned to you, secret evidence. Do you see right and the left? Left was the one during the war on terror who was crying out foul when it was a violation of civil rights at home. Do you think right and left will have some cause to collaborate when it comes to civil rights, or the left will be cheering as long as the rights of the right are violated?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're in a pretty zero-sum state right now in the country. I don't think there's any issue that the left and right can agree on. We're in an era of hyper-partisanship, and any gain by the right is viewed as a loss by the left and vice versa. So even something like civil rights violations, I think, will break down along partisan lines. And there's also this idea or this concept called reciprocal radicalization. So as we've seen more, fascists and neo-Nazis and white supremacists becoming more prolific and more vocal, we've seen a rise in anti-fascist, Antifa, right, and the left. And so there's this cyclical or reciprocal radicalization that takes place.
All right. So since you are an expert on domestic terrorism as well as global terrorism, what are the lessons which you learned in the global war, which could be applicable to the domestic war on terrorism?
I think, information sharing is at the top of that list. I think communicating with our allies, because what we call domestic terrorism, more often than not, ends up having transnational linkages. So talking to our allies, to the Brits, to, the Germans and other countries that have dealt with far-right extremism, and mapping out these networks before they metastasize.
Are some of these networks connected with Russia? I mean, President Putin was talking somewhat in sympathy about the January 6th invader of the Capitol Hill. And so is there a broader connection with people who are sitting, say, the guy who killed 74 Christians in Norway, saying that they were soft on Islam? Are these people connected ideologically with white supremacists, or who think that Christianity is in danger?
Well, certainly the Russian imperial movement, which is based in St. Petersburg, has been listed by the United States as a specially designated global terrorist entity. There's other connections to Russia. There's connections to Ukraine. So there's white supremacists fighting on both sides of that conflict. And we've seen in Europe folks like Anders Breivik, who you mentioned, Brenton Tarrant, the Australian who committed the Christchurch attack in New Zealand, motivated by Islamophobia, motivated by xenophobia and anti-immigration beliefs. And I think that's something that we're likely to see more of, post-COVID. As the world kind of, opens back up, I think we're going to see a lot more friction and, unfortunately, likely a lot more violence.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for director at Sofan Group, coming to us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.